Okay, so welcome to the afternoon session, which will start, and we are very happy to do so, with a talk by Tommaso Monacelli. Tommaso is a professor of economics at Bocconi University and fellow at EGER. We all know him for his contribution to macro in general, but specifically to monetary economics and international economics. And so without further ado, Tommaso, the floor is yours.
Okay. Andrea, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure. So what I'm going to talk about today is a thought experiment that I posed to myself to begin with, which is what should be the right policy mix in the presence of high inflation? So how should monetary and fiscal policies respond to a surge in inflation? We live back again in a period of high inflation. The traditional view, of course, is that addressing inflation is a duty of monetary policy. That's the typical view in academia among policymakers and practitioners and not. But very little is said about the policy mix. And by this, what I mean is, should fiscal policy be a complement or a substitute to monetary policy? So this will be the key question I'm going to pose. So, and to me, this is not an easy question. The answer to this question is not obvious, and especially in the period we are living through, it is a question that has received very little attention. So, what is going to be clear from what I will say is that the answer to this question depends a lot on the origin of inflation. So whether inflation has a monetary root, whether inflation has a real origin, or whether inflation is a fiscal origin. So I'm going to come back to this. By monetary origin of inflation, I mean the classical view, right? Think of the quantity theory. Money and prices are, if in the long run, the velocity of money is roughly constant and output is at potential, money and prices are approximately proportional. Okay, that's a classical monetary view that, of course, I make a very long story short, holds in the long run, meaning it requires full flexibility of prices. But in the short run, we know that prices are not fully flexible. We have overwhelming empirical evidence on that. And so if you want another view of what drives inflation, is not the traditional view that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, but a real new Keynesian view that, if you want, you can call it the Phillips curve view, that inflation is linked to some measure of real activity, the output gap, marginal costs, real marginal costs, unemployment, and that there is a short-run relationship, equilibrium relationship between inflation, the hemisphere, the nominal hemisphere described by inflation, and the real hemisphere described by unemployment or the output gap, right? So this is the new Keynesian. So the monetary view holds in a classical flexible price environment. The real view, if you want, holds in a sticky price, new Keynesian environment, a la Phillips curve. But there is also a fiscal view that it's not usually put at the center stage. And the fiscal view of inflation that has led people like Tom Sargent to say that inflation is always and everywhere a fiscal phenomenon. So when you observe persistent inflation, so movements in the trend in inflation, the origin of that is fiscal, okay? So when the fiscal regime is such that is not oriented to the long-run stabilization of government debt, a so-called non-Ricardian fiscal regime, well, fiscal policy can have very important implications for monetary policy, and monetary stabilization, monetary tightening in this case, is only a necessary condition to stabilize inflation. If fiscal policy is not oriented to the stabilization of the present value budget constraint of the government, any attempt of the monetary authority to tame inflation, for example, by raising interest rates, is going to lead to higher inflation, not to lower inflation. Okay, these are the three views of what drives inflation. Okay, so just keep this in the back of your mind because it will be useful in the kind of question that, again, the kind of question I'm going to pose. And again, the key question to me will be, how should fiscal policy be conducted when inflation is high? Okay, so we have the standard view, right? That monetary policy should respond to rising inflation. This is a chart of policy nominal interest rates in different countries with more or less intensity. Many countries have responded to the surge in inflation, which is widespread in the world, with the raising interest rates, and that's normal. Of course, there are issues at this, concerning the speed at which interest rates should be lifted, how expectations should be handled. But that's, you know, central banks have been raising interest rates against inflation. What in the background fiscal policy has been doing, right, as a response to the energy crisis, has been essentially to introduce energy packages. Okay, so subsidies to shield some part of the population from the cost of inflation, and especially the lower income families that are typically the ones that are most affected. So this chart shows allocated funded to shield the households and business from the energy crisis. Now, if we convert this into numbers, in Germany, this energy package amounts to 7.4% of GDP. I mean, it's huge. So this is a huge employment of fiscal policy to shield the population from the cost of inflation, in particular, inflation that is supply driven, and in this case, and especially in Europe, driven by the rise in energy prices. So we go from 2.8% in France, 5.1% in Italy, up to 7.4% in Germany. So what we are observing as a policy mix is more or less a standard reaction by central banks, raising interest rates, and of course, again, the pace at which interest rates should be risen is a matter of discussion. But monetary policy is tightening. What we are observing concerning fiscal policy is a strongly expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so does that mean that this is the optimal policy mix? Okay, that fiscal policy should be expansionary in periods of high inflation. Okay, so that's the question that I'm going to think of through the lens, beginning through the lens of a model. So the IMF has a view if you want, I'm going to call this the a standard view on the policy mix, or a consensus view. So this is from the WIO of October 22. Monetary policy should stay the course to restore price stability. Okay, and that's the monetary policy tightening. And fiscal policy should aim to alleviate the cost of living pressures. What exactly these fiscal policy packages are doing in many countries. And that's the job of fiscal policy that is typically discussed, even at the European level, right? Especially at the European level. How can we shield at least part of the population from the rising cost of energy, from the electricity bill, from the general cost of inflation? But this consensus, this view that I call the consensus view by the IMF is that fiscal policy should aim to alleviate the cost of living pressures while maintaining a sufficiently tight stance aligned with the monetary policy. Okay, so there's this double-edged view whereby fiscal policy should be both substitute and complement to monetary policy. It should be substitutes, if you want, in the short run to address the cost of inflation. Again, these energy packages, even up to beyond 7% of GDP in Germany, which is huge amount of money, a huge expansion in fiscal policy. But at the same time, fiscal policy should maintain a tight stance aligned with monetary policy. So at the same time, fiscal policy should be a complement to monetary policy. Okay, so this seems a bit confusing. Okay, and so it makes the question I've posed at the beginning to me even more interesting. So in the bottom line, should fiscal policy, provided that we all agree that monetary policy should be tightening in the face of high inflation, should fiscal policy be contractionary, or should fiscal policy be expansionary? And in what sense? In the short run, in the long run, should it be a complement or a substitute? That is not clear. And what lessons have we learned from past experiences of high inflation? Okay, especially the great inflation of the 70s. What type of lessons have we learned on the right policy mix? So if you look at the data, this again is from the WIO. These are each dot is a country, and each position, and the position in each quadrant is the combination of monetary and fiscal policy tightening or loosening. And if you look at these quadrants, you basically see the countries are a bit all over the place. Some countries have a tightening of monetary policy and a loosening of fiscal policy. Some countries have a tightening of monetary policy, the majority, but some other countries, but the same countries have tightening of fiscal policy. So, of course, all situations may be different, but all these countries worldwide are experiencing higher inflation. And here we are seeing a policy mix which is a bit all over the place, right? And so that makes the normative question is even more interesting. Is this optimal or not? And what is optimal through the lens of theory? Okay, and which countries are sort of in line with some basic elements of theory? So that's what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to take a simple model. Okay, I'm going to take a simple model, and that is standard to some extent, and in which the tightening of monetary policy is a standard implication of what monetary policy should do, right? And ask the question, but sufficiently non-standard to build some room for a redistributive motive by fiscal policy. Okay, so this is going to be a tank model, a two-agent New Keynesian model. So I'm gonna use a model just to run with you this thought experiment, meaning how should the policy mix be in a relatively standard model that policymakers actually may run through their heads in thinking of the policy mix. So a tank model is a minimal deviation from a standard representative agent New Keynesian model, a minimal to allow for redistribution. Okay, so that fiscal policy has a meaningful role, can have a meaningful role both for stabilization and redistribution. Because essentially, the fiscal policy packages that I have illustrated before, right, that there are undergoing in many countries are redistributive packages. They try to shield certain parts of the population, especially from the cost of inflation and the cost of and the higher cost of energy. So this is the minimal model that allows you to talk about the policy mix. Okay, I'll come back to this because if you want the standard representative agent New Keynesian model is not really the right model to think about the policy mix, because there is no sense in which in a representative agent economy, fiscal policy can have a redistributional impact. Okay, so that's the minimal model to allow for redistribution. In fact, you have two categories of agents. One is a standard permanent income agent that is forward-looking and who, under rational expectations, is always on its Euler equation and can freely substitute intertemporally through borrowing and lending. Okay, it's not subject to any financial restrictions, and so he's subject to an intertemporal budget constraint and can borrow and save freely. So that's a standard. That would be the standard agent in the representative agent economy with no financial frictions whatsoever. But the other typology of agents, this is now relatively standard in many models. Also, Andreas used this many times, and so it's a hand-to-mouth typology of agents who basically were not free to borrow and lend. Actually, they don't have access to financial markets, and they basically consume out of their labor income. Okay, they're completely compressed onto the period by period budget constraint, and they just consume their labor income. So these are two polar opposite type of consumers. So there is so markets are such that there is imperfect insurance. Okay, there is no except we'll see for the steady state, there will be no perfect equalization of consumption, so there will be consumption inequality at the root of the model. And concerning the rest of the model, we have New Keynesian frictions, monopolistic competition and price rigidity, which are standard elements. So again, this is the minimal model that can allow you to talk about stabilization and redistribution. And we will see this will be a minimal model where stabilization and redistribution are such that there is a trade-off between the two. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna sort of make this model extremely simple. So fiscal policy only is composed of transfers. There is no government spending, there is no government debt. The H agents, which are the hand-to-mouth, receive a transfer that is zero in steady state. So think of the steady state of this economy as a steady state where there is a perfect insurance and consumption is equalized. But outside the steady state, if there are transfers, this is going to generate some degree of inequality. You can show that in this economy, consumption of the H agents, the hand-to-mouth agents, has two elements. It's driven by two parts. One is aggregate consumption, and one is redistribution through transfers. Okay, so higher transfers imply higher consumption for the hand-to-mouth. So an increase in F implies a transfers from, constitutes a transfer from the permanent income consumers to the age consumers. The other component of consumption of the hand-to-mouth agents is aggregate consumption through this parameter chi. This parameter chi is the elasticity of, it reflects the elasticity of the age income of the age consumers to aggregate income. So it basically reflects how idiosyncratic consumption of the age consumers is affected by aggregate consumption. Whether chi is greater or smaller than 1 is important. I'm going to assume that chi is greater than 1, so that the income and then consumption of the hand-to-mouth consumers reacts more than proportionally to aggregate income. So when aggregate GDP goes up by 1%, that means that consumption of the age consumers goes up 1.2%, or vice versa. When aggregate income, aggregate GDP goes down by 1%, income and then consumption of the hand-to-mouth consumers goes down more than proportion. Okay, I'm going to assume that this chi parameter is, which is a combination of other structural parameters in the model, it is greater than 1 because the empirical evidence points clearly to the fact that this parameter is greater than 1. That in recessions, especially, hand-to-mouth consumers, which are the poorer consumers, if you want, are the ones who face a constraint on their ability to borrow, have a disproportionate effect on their income and consumption when aggregate income falls. So, in turn, inequality in consumption can be written as the difference between consumption across the two agents, the permanent income and the hand-to-mouth consumers, and it's proportional to these two terms, aggregate consumption and the transfers. So, higher transfers reduce inequality. Okay, a transfers reduces inequality. That's standard because it's a transfer towards the age income agents. And then there is another component, how much inequality depends on the aggregate business cycle. So if aggregate income and consumption go up, what's going to happen to inequality? If chi is greater than 1, okay, so the income of the age consumers is going to react more than proportionally. When aggregate income goes up in good times, chi is greater than 1, this is negative, inequality is going to fall. So inequality, if chi is greater than 1, is going to fall in good times. And that's also fairly intuitive. Okay, so inequality is going to fall if you have transfers towards the age agents, and inequality is going to fall in good times, in good aggregate times. And that's because disproportionately, higher aggregate income is going to favor the age consumers, okay, which are the ones who have a larger marginal propensity to consume. And so inequality is going to fall because the consumption of the hand-to-mouth consumers is going to increase more than proportionally relative to the consumption of the S consumers. Okay, so in this economy, you can build an aggregate demand equation. So that's the aggregate Euler equation, right? It's aggregate consumption / output. It's a function of expected future consumption. So that's an equilibrium, linearized equilibrium condition, aggregated across the two typologies of agents. And it depends inversely on the real interest rate. This lambda parameter is the share of hand-to-mouth consumers in the economy. When lambda is equal to 0, this elasticity is exactly like in a representative agent economy. But in addition, in an economy with the two typologies of agents, when lambda is positive, there is also a role of transfers in the aggregate demand equation. So transfers are a tool of aggregate demand management. So what you can say in this two-agent economy is that in an economy with heterogeneous consumers, real interest rates and fiscal transfers are perfect substitutes for aggregate demand management, right? You can see that real interest rates and transfers are basically isomorphic. You can achieve the same stabilization of aggregate consumption either through variations in the real interest rate, and that's monetary policy, or through a combination of intertemporal transfers between today and tomorrow. So notice that when lambda is equal to 0, when lambda is equal to 0, this role for transfers washes out, okay, disappears. So from the point of view of aggregate demand stabilization, okay, so you can always find an allocation of intertemporal transfers that is identical, isomorphic to setting real interest rates in some particular way and achieve a certain stabilization of aggregate demand. Okay, but fiscal transfers not only have a stabilization role, which is isomorphic to monetary policy, fiscal transfers have a redistribution role. Fiscal transfers can affect inequality. Okay, that's the relatively rich role that fiscal policy can play here, although in a very simplified economy. Okay, so what's the allocation under flexible price? So in the background, you have nominal rigidities and sticky price. So sticky prices, like in any new Keynesian model, the allocation under flexible prices is an allocation where since there are no technology shocks, so CT star is output and consumption under flexible prices. So it's the natural level of output, also equal to the output gap. So under flexible prices, this is equal to 0. And if CT is equal to 0, from this equation here, inequality is not 0, right? But even under flexible prices, which means 0 inflation and 0 output gap, inequality will still be moving around as a function of transfers. Okay, so we can say that movements in transfers generate inequality, even under flexible prices. So transfers generates an inefficiency. So even transfers generate an inefficiency because, you know, in the steady state we have efficiency. What would require? Efficiency would require perfect stabilization of prices, so mimic the flexible price allocation, and zero inflation, and perfect insurance. Remember, this is an economy we have distortions in sticky prices and market power, and also a distortion in terms of an inefficiency in terms of imperfect insurance across the two agents. So pure efficiency would require flexible prices and perfect insurance. But even with flexible prices in this economy, if there are transfers, there are movements in inequality away from the zero inequality steady state. And so movements of transfers generated inefficiency even under flexible prices. So you can have a trade-off between stabilization of inflation and output, gap at 0, and movements in inequality, if there are transfers. So what is the effect of a transfer? Okay, so again, let me go back to the inequality equation. So inequality is proportional to aggregate consumption. Inequality in consumption, in this case, is proportional to aggregate consumption through the parameter chi, and is proportional to transfers. So suppose that there is an increase in transfers. Okay, so transfers, first of all, as you see from this equation, oops, an increase in transfer is going to reduce inequality directly. So it's a transfer towards the high marginal propensity to consume agents. But an increase in transfers, it's also going to affect aggregate demand, CT. Okay. And if chi is greater than 1, so FT, an increase in FT will affect inequality directly, but then it's going to affect inequality indirectly through aggregate demand. If chi is greater than 1, inequality is going to fall even more. So inequality, when there is a transfer, is going to fall mechanically directly and also indirectly through an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, and so what should be the goal of policy? The goal of policy, of course, is, besides inflation and output gap, is ideally to restore perfect equality, perfect insurance. So if inequality falls below the steady state of zero inequality, what the central bank needs to do is to engineer a recession to increase inequality back to zero. So what I'm trying to say is that this is an economy where there is a trade-off between the stabilization of real activity, the standard motive of stabilization of output and inflation in New Keynesian models, so as to minimize the supply side distortions via policy of zero inflation, and demand side imperfect insurance distortion. So there is a trade-off between standard stabilization of aggregate demand, inflation and output gap, and stabilization of inequality. So there is a trade-off between aggregate demand stabilization and redistribution to achieve perfect insurance. And so, and this is pictured in this object here. So if you, there are three, so this is welfare. So now I'm going to think about the motives of policy in this model, the goals. There are three, so this is the second order approximation of the welfare, of the utility function of the two agents aggregated, okay? And you can show that there are three distinct motives for policy. One is standard inflation. So the welfare objective of the policymaker sees inflation. It pictures the output gap. Remember, C is equal to output, and without productivity shocks, this is also the output gap. And this part of the welfare objective is completely standard as an identical to the standard representative agent New Keynesian model. You have a quadratic objective in inflation and the output gap. Okay, very standard. But as a distinct policy motive in this economy here, you have inequality gamma as well. And so now it's a matter of how, since there is a trade-off between the stabilization of inflation and output on the one hand, and the stabilization of inequality on the other hand, okay, now the policy motive is how do you manage the trade-off between redistribution inequality on the one hand and aggregate demand stabilization on the other hand, which is standard. Okay, so this trade-off is pictured in this welfare objective. There are three distinct welfare goals: inflation and the output gap, as it is standard in representative agent economies, and now as specific to this economy with heterogeneous agents, there is also inequality. Okay, so now I have I could have even started from here. Okay, so far basically what I've done is been to describe you an economy with two agents and imperfect insurance, and introduced you to why policy can have three distinct objects, welfare-based: inflation, output gap, inequality. Okay, and why there could be a trade-off between stabilizing inequality and stabilizing inflation in the output gap on the other hand. Okay, so now I'm going to think about, so now that I have this welfare objective, again, this is micro-founded. I mean, I don't know, I made a long story short in deriving this objective, but it's rooted in the model. Okay, so now I'm going to pose the policy question that I had in mind. Suppose that we have an increase in inflation. So how am I going to generate an increase in inflation? This economy has a Phillips curve, a new Keynesian Phillips curve. Inflation is a function of expected future inflation and the output gap. And now I'm going to introduce a cost push shock. So these are shocks typically used in this literature that generate a dilemma for policy. These are shocks that are going to generate an increase in inflation regardless of any movement in the output gap. So that if you want to stabilize inflation back to zero when there is a cost push shock, you need so inflation goes up because of the shock. And so if you want to bring inflation back to zero, right, you need to lower the output gap. And so this cost push shock, as it is well known, are beastie shocks because they generate a dilemma for stabilization in the standard new Keynesian model. Okay, so this is going to be my way to generate inflation. But now the policy mix is richer than the standard monetary policy stabilization objective in new Keynesian models. Now I'm going to ask, so what is the optimal policy with endogenous transfers? Okay, because remember, policy now is mixed between monetary and fiscal. Policy now has the objective both to stabilize inflation and the output gap as it is standard, but also it's going to have the aim of stabilizing inequality as much as possible to zero. Okay, remember, zero inequality is part of the efficiency package. Okay, but stabilizing inequality to zero may conflict with the stabilization objective of stabilizing inflation and the output gap. So I'm going to call this optimal policy with endogenous transfers. Okay, so if I work out the maximization, so the minimization of this quadratic objective subject to this constraint, so you can reach two first-order conditions. The first one is a targeting rule, as people call it in this literature, right? A combination of inflation, output gap, and inequality that should be optimal, that should hold at the optimum. Okay. But then there is going to be a condition on optimal transfers. Okay, so transfers should be proportional to the output gap. Okay, so the output gap should be inversely, given that chi is greater than 1, should be inversely proportional to transfers. So what is the intuition, right, about the policy mix? It's all in this line here. Okay, suppose that there is a fall in real activity, right? That comes from the cost push shock. So the cost push shock is going to lead to a rise in inflation. That's my energy shock, supply side energy shock. In order to bring inflation down, right, you want to lower the output gap because there is a Phillips curve, and the way we can affect stabilization-wise, we can affect inflation is by bringing the output gap down. So there is a fall in real activity and a rise in inflation. That's the standard trade-off that supply side shocks generate. Okay, so that's fall in real activity. Okay, that's standard. But if chi is greater than 1, remember, the fall in real activity is going to have an impact on inequality, right? Here we go. The fall in real activity, if chi is greater than 1, is going to generate a fall in inequality. Sorry, a rise in inequality, because CT is falling, but chi is greater than 1. So the contraction in real activity is going to generate an increase in inequality. When chi, the elasticity of H income to aggregate income is greater than 1, and if there is a fall in aggregate real activity, this is going to affect disproportionately the poor agents, the hand-to-mouth agents. So when aggregate real activity falls, inequality is going to rise. All right, so real activity falls because of the cost-push shock dilemma. If chi is greater than 1, this is going to generate an increase in inequality. So now, the objective of policy is the one of taming the increase in inequality. Inequality is rising. What do you engineer on the fiscal policy side is a transfer towards the constrained agents, because we know that a transfer is going to make inequality lower. Okay, so fiscal policy, the fiscal policy part of the policy mix is going to imply a rise in transfers, right, to affect inequality and bring inequality as much as possible back to 0. So it's going to engineer a transfer towards constrained agents in order to stabilize inequality. Okay, so here we have through the lens of this model, okay, and via a very simplified way of modeling what fiscal policy does, okay, here we have the answer to our question. In response to a rise in inflation, which is driven by supply side, the supply side, here, the cost push shock, what should fiscal policy do? Okay, and the answer of this model is that fiscal policy should increase transfers to stabilize inequality. Okay, so in an economy where you have a minimal degree of heterogeneity, and imperfect insurance across agents, you know, you have the monetary and fiscal policy are clearly substitutes. So the stabilization of inflation and output is the job of the central bank, is the job of monetary policy, whereas fiscal policy through transfers should care about the inequality part. Okay, we will never, in response to a cost push shock, we will never reach a 0-0-0 triplet. Okay, we will never be able to completely stabilize inflation, the output gap, and inequality. But monetary policy will do its best to stabilize inflation and the output gap as close as possible to 0. And fiscal policy through transfers, by engineering an increase in transfers, is going to take care of inequality. All right, so, you know, that's a thought experiment. It's not the only model you can use, but it's a minimal extension from the standard New Keynesian model in order to allow for fiscal policy and allow both a stabilization and a redistribution motive for the two policies. So that the answer this model is giving to me is very much in line with what many governments are doing today. Remember, what are many governments doing? They are engineering this big policy packages of transfers to agents in order to shield part of the population from the increase in the energy bill, which leads very much to an increase in inequality, right? Because inflation is a regressive tax, and inflation, given the disproportionate weight that energy and food play in the basket of consumption of the poorer agents, right? Inflation is a very distortionary tax in the regressive sense. Okay, so what in fact all governments, as far as fiscal policy is concerned, have been doing is exactly ceteris paribus, is exactly what the model is implying. Right? So fiscal policy should be expansionary. answering my initial question, what should fiscal policy be doing in a period of high inflation? Well, fiscal policy should engineer transfers to take care of the inequality mode, to stabilize inequality, right? Monetary policy stabilizes the cost push shock as far as inflationary activity is concerned. There is a separation principle, right, between monetary and fiscal policy. Well, fiscal transfers should be chosen so as to achieve not perfect insurance because it's unfeasible, but as much as possible close to perfect insurance. So this is isomorphic to what would happen. The separation principle is such that monetary policy does exactly what it would do in a rank economy with a representative agent, so that fiscal policy should take care of the inequality part. But the answer to our policy mix question posed at the beginning is that fiscal policy, represented in a very crude and simple way here, is that fiscal policy in a period of high inflation should be expansion. And then that's not obvious at all, right? You may be tempted to think that in a period of high inflation, you would like to have contractionary fiscal policy to help a monetary policy to reduce aggregate demand and stabilize inflation, right? So through the lens of this model, and also through the practice, observed practice of many governments, right? It seems that that instead fiscal policy, what fiscal policy should do and is doing is that fiscal policy should be expansionary. Right? It should not lean against the wind, right? But should blow into the wind of inflation. That's not so obvious. So let me now devote the last 5 to 10 minutes to actually understand why this is obvious or not obvious, right? So let me just say that if you wanted a more complicated model of fiscal policy, you can introduce in this model government spending. Okay, in that case, you would increase the number of objectives and goals in the welfare objectives, because government spending would be introduced by showing up in the utility function. So I'm not going to go through the model with government spending, but of course now government spending should be financed through taxes, and there is an issue of whether taxes should be progressive or regressive. Okay, but here's what the model is implying. So under two cases, progressive taxation and regressive. Progressive taxation is the standard case. Okay, this is the response to an inflationary shock, okay, that rises inequality. Okay, it lowers the output gap, it raises inflation. So here is the stabilization dilemma of what to do with output gap and inflation. So optimal policy strikes a balance between stabilizing the output gap and stabilizing inflation, and see what fiscal policy again should do in this model is to expand government spending. Very similar to the insight that we had with transfers. And again, because inequality has risen, you want to expand government spending and so transfers in order to reduce the impact of inequality as much as possible. You will not be able to completely stabilize inequality, completely stabilize inflation, and completely stabilize the output gap. That's why the optimal policy mix is interesting in this economy, right? But again, the message is that government spending should be countercyclical, should be expansionary in bad times. And bad times are also inflationary times when the shock comes from the supply side, like the times we are living through. Again, so the message of the model, even with government spending, is very similar. Optimal government spending in the face of inflationary supply side, the cost push shocks, optimal government spending should be counter-cyclical if taxation is progressive. So again, through the lens of the model, fiscal policy should be expansionary in a period of high supply side inflation. right? So that is interesting, right? It's and again not obvious at all, at least to me. So does that mean that fiscal policy should then be a substitute of monetary policy in a period of high inflation? So monetary policy should be tightening, raising interest rates because inflation is going up, as standard, but as a complement to that, fiscal policy should actually be expansionary. This is what the model is saying, and this is what, in fact, we are observing in many countries with these very large subsidy packages that many countries have engineered. Right? So the type of suggestion that the model is giving is intriguing. Not obvious. Monetary policy should be contractionary as standard. Fiscal policy should be expansionary. Raise government spending, raise transfers. But so the answer to this dilemma, to this apparent puzzle, is that we should not forget that in the background of the New Keynesian model, fiscal policy is Ricardian. What does it mean? It means you don't see really in any New Keynesian model what fiscal policy does with the present value budget constraint of the government, but it's fiscal policy is Ricardian in the sense that even if it engineers transfers in the short run, and so it is expansionary in the short run, it must be contractionary in the long run. Silently, but obviously, fiscal policy should never deviate from the objective of stabilizing government debt in the long run. So even if it engineers an expansion today, it goes without saying that the expansionary fiscal policy today will have to be followed by a contraction of fiscal policy in the future in order for the present value budget constraint of the government to be satisfied. Okay, we never say this. This is what the fiscal theory of inflation scholars typically claim on the New Keynesian macroeconomics, right? You never talk about fiscal policy, but in the background, fiscal policy plays a very important role. It's silent, but it's a necessary condition, right, to stabilize inflation. That in the background, even if fiscal policy is expansionary in the short run, it is always contractionary in the long run, because government debt must be stabilized and the present value budget constraint of the government must be satisfied. So the proposition about the policy mix in this two-agent New Keynesian model is that monetary and fiscal policy are substitute in the short run, yes, but they are complements in the long run. So they are substitutes in the short run in the sense that monetary policy is tightening and fiscal policy is engineering an increase in government spending or an increase in transfers, right? But fiscal policy remains Ricardian if it is Ricardian, not necessarily, but in the New Keynesian models typically is, so that in the long run, it's always silently true. The fiscal policy will engineer a contraction in order to satisfy the present value budget constraint of the government. Right? But the fiscal policy regime may not necessarily be Ricardian. This is the fiscal theory of the price level. And that's the fiscal inflation. The fiscal origin of inflation arise the minute you start thinking of the fiscal policy regime not necessarily being as being Ricardian, right? This is what Sargent and Wallace were pointing out at the beginning of the 80s, right? Without what the fiscal theory of inflation says, that without this long-run fiscal stabilization, right? Without what we take it as given, that fiscal policy will always make the present value budget constraint of the government will be satisfied through a future fiscal contraction, through the expectations of a future fiscal contraction, right? If there is no fiscal backup of this sort, what Sargent and Wallace were saying, right, is that the monetary policy can backfire. You can keep increasing interest rates, right, and be contractionary, but this will do nothing but increase the service cost of debt and will make, satisfying the present value budget constraint of the government even more difficult. And so it's going to become even more necessary to resort to the inflation tax to satisfy the present value budget constraint of the government. So in a nutshell, if the fiscal policy regime is not Ricardian, So if the fiscal policy regime deviates from the expectations that the government will stabilize government debt in the future, right? Any increase in the interest rate is inflation. Okay, it's going to raise the service cost of debt, right? And so you're going to need more and more inflation to jump to satisfy the present value budget constraint. So if monetary tightening is not supported by the expectation of appropriate fiscal adjustments, the deterioration of fiscal imbalances will lead to even higher inflationary pressure, right? So Bianchi and Melosi in a series of papers talk about, in this case, fiscal stagflation. You raise interest rates, you don't impact on inflation, inflation will keep rising, and you only have an effect on real activity. So inflation will be driven by the fiscal regime, by the expectations that the government is not committed to stabilize government debt in the future, and that this is going to lead to a vicious circle of rising nominal interest rates, rising inflation and stagnation, and increasing debt. This is what I define as fiscal stagflation. So the key to the policy mix then, right? So this leads Sargent also to say that persistently high inflation is always and everywhere a fiscal phenomenon. And it's very much plausible that behind the persistent inflation in the US, for example, there is a very important fiscal component. Right, so to conclude, right, so I'm going to do a little bit of history of the great inflation of the 70s, right? There is in fact, what really made the policy mix capable of addressing and conquering the great inflation of the 70s. The standard view is Volcker, right? It's the Volcker disinflation. It's the idea that at some point in 1971, Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the Fed. It started increasing interest rates like crazy in a continuous manner. It stuck to his own position, and this sooner or later led to a decrease in inflation. But it's much less said, and this is the fiscal view of inflation, that this happened at some point with the aid of fiscal policy. So at the beginning, inflation was rising in the US in the 60s and the 70s through a very large increase in government spending. Now, the long-lasting welfare programs associated with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, with the war in Vietnam. So the beginning of the Great Inflation in the 70s is really demand-driven, with the monetary policy not really addressing the surge in inflation. So the policy mix was inflation-oriented. Then it came cost-push shocks associated to the oil crisis, but that was temporary. Right? The chairman of the time, Arthur Burns, was pressured repeatedly by the Johnson administration and the Nixon administrations to keep interest rates low. So there was a fiscal expansion, but monetary policy was not really committed to raising interest rates and combat inflation. Then Reagan was appointed president, and some people think that the Reaganomics was really an expansion in the deficit, but in fact, Reagan was appointed under a very strong anti-inflation platform. The rhetoric under the Reagan administration of starving the beast, right, sort of paved the way, in fact, for expectations from the fiscal policy regimes that, fiscal policy would have prevented government debt to explode, right? And so in the 80s, so the bottom line is that inflation in the 80s was really conquered and reduced, not only because monetary policy did the right thing of increasing interest rates repeatedly and keeping interest rates and real interest rates very, very high, but the fiscal policy regime changed. Paul Volcker said that unlike his predecessors, President Reagan had a strong visceral aversion to inflation. And so there was a fiscal backing to monetary policy. This did not result immediately in Reagan adopting at the very beginning a very contractionary fiscal policy. But remember, what is needed on the fiscal policy side is not necessarily in the short run that fiscal policy is contractionary. Fiscal policy can be expansionary, like in our model. The most important thing is that it's Ricardian in the long run, is that people expect that sooner or later a contraction in the deficit will be engineered in order to stabilize government debt. And the idea is that the Reagan administration in the 80s, both administrations were consistent with the Ricardian fiscal regime, and that the contribution of fiscal policy was critical in order to stabilize inflation. Then there was a series of acts on the fiscal policy side, and then Reagan became a strong advocate of reducing spending, through reducing the size of the government, the start the beast rhetoric, et cetera, et cetera. So the point that I'm trying to make, to sum up, right, is that we typically think that we were able to reduce it, and this is very important for today's inflationary episode, right? We think we should learn that we have learned the lesson of the 70s that monetary policy should be very much contractionary in order to reduce inflation. But there is a very important view that claims, right, that a necessary and key element to reduce inflation, the great inflation of the 70s, was fiscal policy. Was that the strong anti-inflationary monetary policy was helped by the change in the fiscal policy regime under the two Reagan administrations. And that the long-run expectations of debt stabilization was oriented in the right way, right? So that even if fiscal policy was expansionary in the short run with Reagan, it set expectations of future stabilization of government debt in the right way in the 1980s. And that was critical to reduce trend inflation. Once the spike in inflation coming from the supply side oil shock evaporated, the trend element was eliminated through the right fiscal and monetary policy regime. So why is this important to conclude? Because it's not clear where the fiscal policy regime and the fiscal policy mix is today in the US and in the eurozone. Right? There is no clear mentioning in the US that the Fed tightening cycle should be also complemented, right, by a clear setting of expectations on the fiscal policy side that government debt should be stabilized in the medium to long run. Okay. In fact, the Biden administration engineered a huge fiscal package. There is no, clear vocal position in favor of long-run fiscal stabilization, and the same is true in the eurozone. There is no debate about the fiscal rules. The Stability and Growth Pact has been suspended. We don't know. There is now some initial, very formal and behind the scenes debate about what the new set of fiscal rules is going to be. But, we have the ECB raising interest rates, but what is fiscal policy doing? Again, it's doing the short-run optimal thing, engineering a redistributive package in favor of the less wealthy to shield those families from the cost of the energy bill. But in the long run, there is no setting of expectations in the direction of stabilization of government debt. Okay, and so this may make the job of the central bank actually hopeless. The ECB could be continuously raising interest rates, but if fiscal policy regime doesn't become complementary, from substitutes to complement, okay, in order to set expectations in the Ricardian fiscal sense, the stabilization of inflation, both in the US and in the eurozone, may prove very difficult. So with this, I think I ran out of time, so I stop.